1,000 years ago, Norse explorers reached the wilds of North America, and then they slipped almost entirely out of the official record. For centuries, their voyages were treated as legend. Fireflit stories scribbled down in Iceland generations after the fact, impossible to prove, easy to dismiss. Mainstream history drew a hard line at a single windswept camp on the edge of Newfoundland and insisted that was the end of it. But buried in the soil of that camp, and scattered far beyond it, something has surfaced that refuses to settle. In the last few years, new dating science, new genetic work, and a fresh look at those old sagas have begun pulling the buried story back into the light. So here's the question. Were the sagas telling the truth all along? And what did the Vikings actually find and lose on a continent they were never supposed to have reached? To understand why the rest of this story is so hard for the academic world to accept, you first have to understand what it is willing to accept. And there is only one place in all of North America where the experts have officially agreed that Norse explorers set foot. A windswept stretch of coastline at the very northern tip of Newfoundland, a place called Meadows. It is the edge of the continent in every sense that matters. Treeless. Battered by Atlantic wind. The kind of place a sailor sees and knows they have arrived at the end of something. Excavations began there in the 1960s, led by the Norwegian explorer Helix Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad, and what they pulled from the turf rewrote the textbooks. Beneath the soil and grass lay the outlines of 8 buildings, dwellings and workshops. The largest, a multi-room structure researchers call the Leader's Hall. And the artifacts left no room for argument. A ring-headed bronze pin of the kind worn to fasten a Norse cloak. A soapstone spindle whorl used in spinning wool. Fragments of iron nails. And in the workshops, something decisive. A furnace. Heaps of iron slag. The unmistakable evidence that whoever lived here was not merely passing through. They were smelting iron from local bog ore. They were repairing ships. They were making tools. This was a working camp, equipped, organized, and operational. For decades, the precise dating of the site stayed frustratingly vague. Radiocarbon analysis placed the Norse here somewhere between 990 and 1050 of the Common Era, a window of 60 years. And then, in October of 2021, in a study published in the journal Nature, an international team led by chronologists Michael D. and Margot Quitums at the University of Groningen did something nobody had managed before. They pinpointed the exact year. Their method was extraordinary. In the year 992, a massive solar storm struck the Earth and flooded the atmosphere with a sudden burst of radioactive carbon. Trees across the world absorbed that signal into the ring they grew the following year, and it is still locked in the wood today. The team found 3 pieces of wood from Meadows, all cut with metal blades the indigenous population did not possess, and all carrying that solar storm signal exactly 28 growth rings in from the bark. The conclusion was inescapable. The trees were felled in the year 1021. Exactly 1,000 years ago, 471 years before Columbus. And here is where the official story begins to feel incomplete. For all the iron and timber the Norse left behind, the site is strangely empty of the things that make a home. Almost no household items. The structures could hold perhaps 70 to 90 people, and yet they stayed only a handful of years. The archaeologist Brigida Wallace, who spent decades excavating the site for Parks Canada, has been clear about what it actually was. Not a colony, a base, a place to repair ships, smelt iron, and prepare for the next leg of a journey. And that single word reframes everything. Because you do not cross an ocean, build a forge, and repair vessels at the edge of an unknown continent in order to sit on the beach. You do that because you intend to go further. So the question the experts have never satisfactorily answered is simple. If Meadows was only a base, then where exactly were they going? The answer was written down 800 years ago, and for most of that time, nobody trusted it. Two Icelandic texts, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, set down in the early 1200s, record voyages that had happened 2 centuries earlier, and that gap is exactly why scholars dismissed them. The sagas were carried for generations by word of mouth before anyone wrote them down, and over that long retelling, legend had fused with fact until the two could no longer be cleanly pulled apart. So the academic world set them aside. Folklore, they said, embellishment dressed as history. But the science of the last 60 years keeps confirming the texture of these stories, and the journey they describe begins not with a hero, but with a man who got lost. According to the Greenlander saga, in the 980s, while Eric the Red was establishing his colony in Greenland, an Icelander named Bjarni Herjolfsson was blown off course and saw an unknown coastline rising out of the southwestern sea. His crew argued over what it was. They concluded only that it was certainly not Greenland. And then, remarkably, they refused to land. They turned for home, leaving the new world to someone bolder. That someone was Leif Erikson. Around the year 1000, he bought Bjarni's very ship and sailed out deliberately to find what Bjarni had only glimpsed. When he reached it, he carved the coastline into 3 lands and named each one. Helluland, the land of flat stones, which researchers identify as Baffin Island. Markland, the land of forests, almost certainly Labrador. And to the south, the prize, a place where wild grapes were said to grow. He called it Vinland, the land of vines. Leif sheltered there through a winter, and for a moment the story is one of discovery and abundance. But it does not stay that way. Because the next Norseman to sail west was Leif's brother, Thorvald, and his voyage is where the saga turns dark. Thorvald and his men were exploring the coast when they spotted 3 strange rounded shapes on a beach. Drawing closer, the humps revealed themselves to be 3 boats made from stretched animal skins turned upside down, and beneath them slept 9 men. The Norse fell on them. 8 were killed. 1 escaped. And that single survivor brought back a reckoning. Soon a fleet of skin boats came skimming across the water toward them. Thorvald ordered his men aboard their ship and raised a wall of shields along the sides, and the Norse weathered the assault, deflecting arrows and blows with oars and timber until the attackers broke off and fled. By every measure of weaponry, it was a Norse victory, but it cost them. An arrow found the one gap in the shield wall and lodged in Thorvald's stomach, and he seemed to understand at once that the wound was fatal. He drew the arrow out himself, and the words the saga puts in his mouth land like a curse on everything that follows. They had won, he said, a fine and fruitful country, but they would hardly be allowed to enjoy it. He was buried in that unknown land, and his men sailed home. For a century, all of this was read as fiction. A good story and nothing more. But Thorvald's dying line contains a truth the Norse would learn again and again. They had not arrived in an empty paradise. Someone was already there. And the Norse, for all their iron, were hopelessly outnumbered. The Norse had a name for the people they kept colliding with. They called them Skraelings, a word that may come from the Old Norse skra, meaning dried skin, perhaps for the hide boats and hide clothing the Norse saw. And the most ambitious attempt to settle among them belonged to a wealthy Icelander named Thorfinn Karlsefni, who arrived with a large band of warriors and sheltered in the very structures Leif had built. It was here, in this brief and fragile foothold, that Karlsefni's wife Gudrid gave birth to a son they named Snorri, the first known European child born in the New World. For a moment, it looked like the beginning of something permanent. It was not. When summer came, men emerged from the surrounding forest wanting to trade their furs for weapons. Karlsefni refused, almost certainly fearing those weapons would one day be turned on him, and offered milk instead. The locals took it. And here is a detail that modern science quietly slips into the story. Much of the indigenous population of the Americas was lactose intolerant, which means the men who drank that milk very likely fell ill soon after. Researchers have wondered whether they believed they had been poisoned, and whether that suspicion was one of the first sparks that turned trade into war. What followed was a brutal demonstration of the gap between the two worlds. Karlsefni, watching his men grow nervous at numbers that seemed endless, devised a trap. He cleared a stretch of forest, set a bull at the edge of it as a strange and bellowing lure, and used a small group of his men as bait. When the battle came, the saga grows vague, but the outcome does not. The Norse, with iron blades and disciplined shield walls, inflicted heavy casualties before the attackers melted back into the trees. And yet, even in victory, Karlsefni had seen enough. There would always be fear and strife, he concluded, on account of those who already lived there. The Norse stayed one more winter and sailed home. A later attempt by Freydis Eiriksdottir collapsed not from native attack at all, but from the settlers turning on each other, and after a single winter they too abandoned the land. So who were these people who turned back the Vikings? Researchers point to the ancestors of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq, peoples who lived in their thousands around the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Estimates run from 6,000 to 15,000 across the region. A native complex called Point Revenge has been excavated along the Labrador coast and dated squarely to the 10th and 11th centuries, placing these people in exactly the time and place the sagas describe. Their tools were stone, not iron. Arrows tipped with quartz and flint. Clubs studded with beaver teeth and sharpened stone. They wore no armor, but covered their skin in red ochre. Against Norse weaponry, they were, piece for piece, outmatched. And it did not matter, because what they had was numbers, and the will to keep coming. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you. The most consequential thing these people may have done was not lose a battle, but win a war of attrition that history almost forgot. Their resistance is very likely the reason the Norse never came back in force, the reason no permanent colony took root, the reason European settlement of the Americas was delayed by 5 full centuries. A few thousand people with stone-tipped arrows may have changed the entire timeline of the world, but the Norse had not crossed an ocean for nothing. The question is what, exactly, they were after. To understand what drew the Norse across the ocean, you have to understand how precarious their position really was. The settlers who sailed for Vinland came mostly from Greenland, and Greenland was never a comfortable place to live. Even at its height, the colony held no more than 2,000 people, clinging to the rim of an icebound land that gave them most of what they needed, but withheld 3 things they could not live without: salt, flour, and good timber. Everything else had to come from somewhere, and the only direction with abundance was west. But it was not lumber alone that pulled them. It was something far more seductive. Grapes. The name Vinland means the land of vines, and to a Norseman that name carried a charge we can easily miss. Grapes did not grow in Scandinavia, which meant wine had to be imported at ruinous expense from places like France. Wine was a symbol of wealth and power, a luxury reserved for the elite. So imagine what a near-limitless supply of grapes in a newly discovered land would have meant to a man like Leif Erikson. Not just food, prestige, status, proof of reach. And the Norse pushed further south than that single coastal camp to find these things. The evidence is small and strange and entirely convincing. Butternuts were found at Lonzo Meadows. Butternuts do not grow north of what is now New Brunswick, which means the Norse, or something they carried, had traveled well south of the camp into a warmer, richer country laced with rivers and hardwood forest. The sagas seem to remember this in the way they describe two separate settlements. Straumfjord, a year-round base almost certainly identical to Lanza Meadows, and Hop, a southern summer camp where lumber and grapes were gathered, most likely along the New Brunswick shore. From the cold, spare edge of Newfoundland, the Norse were reaching down into the verdant heart of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And reaching was something they were extraordinarily good at. The Viking longship had a draft of less than 1 meter, the depth of water it needed to stay afloat. Let that detail settle. A vessel capable of crossing the open North Atlantic could also slip up shallow rivers and glide across lakes that would have grounded any deeper ship. And when the water ran out, the Norse did not turn back. They hauled their boats overland on logs, a technique called portage, a skill they had honed for generations, threading shallow ships through the rivers of Eastern Europe. The capability to push deep into a continent was already in their blood. But here, honesty demands a limit, and it is worth naming clearly. Most researchers do not believe the Norse ranged far south of Vinland. The reasoning is elegant. If they had rounded Cape Breton and pressed on, they would have met terrain so different that they would almost certainly have given it a new name, a new land in the saga record. No such land appears, so the reach was real, but it was bounded. A few hundred kilometers of coast and river, not a sweep across the continent. And with all of this on offer, the grapes, the timber, the warm southern forests, the Norse still walked away. The Atlantic crossing was murderous. Longitude was impossible to measure, and Europe already supplied everything Vinland could and more. Vinland was a backwater, beautiful, dangerous, and not worth the dying. So they left. But the question is what they left behind, scattered in soil and bone and blood, waiting 1,000 years to be found. What they left behind comes down to us as a handful of threads, and the honest truth is that no single one of them proves anything on its own. The power is in laying them side by side. Start with a coin. In 1957, at a place called the Goddard site on the coast of Maine, an amateur archaeologist pulled a small, worn silver coin out of the soil of a Native American settlement. For 20 years, it was mistaken for an English penny. Then experts looked again and realized what it actually was: a Norwegian coin minted during the reign of King Olaf Kyrre between roughly 1067 and 1093. A genuine Norse coin from the 11th century buried in American earth. And here the honesty matters. The coin's authenticity is not in doubt, but no other Norse object was ever found at the site, and the settlement itself dates a century or more after the Norse had gone. So the most likely explanation is not a Viking standing on that beach, but the coin passing hand to hand along indigenous trade networks until it came to rest there. And yet think about what even that requires. For a Norwegian coin to enter those networks at all, someone, somewhere on this continent, first had to be holding it. Then there is the metal. Bits of copper tied to Norse-style working have surfaced at scattered sites across the northeastern region. Not proof, but a hint. A suggestion that Norse material culture seeped, however faintly, into indigenous hands. And then there is the thread that is hardest to wave away, because it is written not in stone or metal, but in living blood. In 2010, a team of Icelandic and Spanish geneticists publishing in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology found something they did not expect. More than 80 living Icelanders carry a distinct genetic lineage, which they named C1E, traceable through the female line back centuries. And the closest relatives of that lineage are not European. They are Native American. The implication is staggering. It suggests that around the year 1000, a Native American woman entered the Norse bloodline and was carried back across the Atlantic to Iceland, where her genetic signature survives in her descendants to this day. But the researchers themselves were careful, and so should we be. They could not entirely rule out a European or Asian origin for the lineage. It is rare. It is faint. Nothing about it is settled. And that caution is exactly what makes the work credible rather than wishful. The same is true of the final thread, the one academia was slowest to hear. The oral histories of indigenous peoples, carried in voice across generations, dismissed for most of the 20th century as legend. We now know those traditions can encode real events, floods and eruptions and arrivals, with extraordinary accuracy. The field is only beginning to admit how much it lost by refusing to listen. So consider what you have when you put it all together. A genuine Norse coin in American soil. A scatter of Norse-style metalwork along the eastern reaches. A strand of Native American DNA woven into the people of Iceland. An indigenous memory of strangers arriving long before any European was supposed to be there. Any one of these can be explained away, and skeptics have explained each of them away in turn. But all of them together form a pattern that grows harder to dismiss with every passing year. Which raises the obvious and uncomfortable question. If the evidence is mounting, why did the experts resist it for so long? The answer is not a single thing. It is three forces working quietly together, and none of them is simply stubbornness. Start with the tools. For most of the last century, the science needed to actually test these claims did not exist. The solar storm dating that finally pinned Land's Meadows to a single year only arrived in 2021. The genetic sequencing that revealed the C1e lineage in living Icelanders matured only in the last few decades. The verdicts that hardened generations ago were reached with the instruments of generations ago, and for a long time there was simply no way to retest them. You cannot fault a scholar in 1950 for failing to read a signal locked inside a tree ring that no one would learn how to find for another 70 years. The caution was not always prejudice. Sometimes it was the honest limit of what could be known. And there is a second reason the experts held back, one that deserves to be said plainly. The sagas really were unreliable. They were carried by word of mouth for 2 centuries before anyone wrote them down, and over that span, legend genuinely did fuse with fact until the seams disappeared. A saga that describes a real voyage might also describe a one-legged creature on a distant shore. So a scholar who treated these texts with suspicion was not being closed-minded. They were being responsible. The mistake was not the caution itself. The mistake was assuming the caution was permanent, that because a source was tangled, it could never be untangled by anything but the texts themselves. The third force is the quietest and the most powerful. Institutional inertia. Once a story is built into the textbooks, into the museum displays, into the curriculum that trains the next generation of scholars, it takes enormous effort to move it. The idea that Columbus reached an empty continent was the foundation of historical education for over a century. The idea that Lonzo Meadows was the only Norse site in the Americas has anchored Viking scholarship for over 50 years. To admit that the Norse traded, fought, and bled their way along these coasts, that one of them may have carried a Native American woman home across the ocean, is to redraw a map that has hung on the wall for a very long time. It means rewriting chapters, re-examining artifacts long ago filed away as curiosities, and crediting indigenous oral histories that the field spent 100 years dismissing. That is not a small thing to ask of any institution, but the map is being redrawn anyway. The date is no longer vague, it is locked. The genetics are no longer fringe speculation. They are peer-reviewed. The sagas are no longer treated as fairy tales, but as flawed and valuable witnesses, the way historians treat every old and imperfect source. and indigenous testimony is finally being taken seriously rather than waved away. The story is moving slowly in the direction the evidence has been pointing for years, and yet the restraint has to hold to the very end because the BAR for rewriting history is high, and it should be. To truly prove a sustained Norse presence beyond that single coastal camp, you would need a Norse grave in undisturbed ground, a sealed inland site, datable Scandinavian remains paired with unmistakable artifacts. None of that has yet been found in the heartland of the continent. The pattern is strong, the proof is not yet complete, which means the question is not closed. It is open, and the ground has not finished giving up its answers. For 1,000 years, the truth sat just beneath the surface, waiting. A camp on a windswept coast, now dated to a single year. A set of sagas that turned out to be remembering something real. A people who fought the strangers off and may have changed the course of the world by doing it. A coin in the soil of Maine. A strand of DNA carried home across the ocean and still alive in Iceland today. And a story held in indigenous voices long before any university thought to ask. The Vikings did not simply touch the edge of the continent and turn back. They landed, they traded, they bled, they buried their dead, and they left behind a thread of evidence that 1,000 years of silence could not fully cover. The discovery is not finished. It is still happening. And what comes up next may finally settle everything.